"Oh, I can prove it," I replied, my hand pulling more documents from my briefcase. Bank records showing mysterious funds flowing into her shell company after each desperate property sale, emails discussing plans to coerce those who refuse to join the HOA, and my personal favorite, a text message from her, instructing how to make an electrical fire look like an accident. The room erupted in murmurs and gasps of shock. Karen Mitchell's hand trembled violently, coffee sloshing over the edge of her cup. "This is absolute nonsense," she screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "You can't just barge in here and slander me like this. I'll sue you for defamation." That was the signal I'd been waiting for. I reached into my briefcase one last time, pulling out a judge's robe. The silk fabric billowed dramatically as I draped it over my shoulders. "Federal Judge Tobias Rutherford," I declared, savoring the satisfaction as Karen's face turned as pale as a sheet of paper. "Presiding over case number 2026 CR 317, United States versus Mitchell and co-conspirators, a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy." The coffee cup slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor and shattering into pieces. Hot liquid splashed onto her expensive shoes, but she didn't even notice. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, words failing her. "FBI. I am Tobias Rutherford, 38 years old, a land rights attorney born and raised in the peaceful suburbs of Fairhaven, now settled in the bustling town of Ashtonville. My job is to protect those oppressed by greedy forces, but I never imagined I'd find myself fighting to hold onto the Victorian house on Elmwood Road, the place that holds my childhood memories with my grandmother. That house, with its deep purple trim and wildflower garden, is all I have left of her, the woman who taught me the meaning of resilience. Let me tell you the maddening story I had to endure. Leave a comment with the word 9 so I know you're ready for the most gripping moments waiting ahead. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to join me through the twists of this tale. That morning seemed as calm as any other. I sat on my grandmother's 120-year-old porch swing, holding a steaming cup of coffee, watching the first rays of sunlight blaze across the Ashtonville sky, highlighting the purple trim of the Victorian house. Then I saw her, Karen Mitchell, striding forward like she was leading a parade, heading straight for my mailbox. In her hand was an envelope clutched tightly as if it were the key to the entire world. I'd seen the calculating glint in her eyes before at the neighborhood meetings she hosted in her pristine, extravagant mansion next door. My heart pounded as she dropped the envelope into the mailbox, then lingered, slowly panning her phone's camera across my front yard. My grandmother's garden was in full bloom, vibrant petals stretching freely, a stark contrast to the perfectly trimmed hedges of Karen's property. I knew she despised every unruly flower that refused to bend to her control. That envelope held what she called a golden opportunity, an invitation to join the newly formed HOA, complete with a flashy flyer boasting identical beige houses and mailboxes aligned like soldiers in a row. The joining fee was $9,000 plus $580 a month. But what set my blood boiling wasn't the money, it was the attached list of mandatory changes. Repaint everything in unapproved colors, including the deep purple trim my grandmother had chosen herself. Clear out the heritage flower garden to plant their standard-compliant shrubs. Remove the ancient wind chimes that had rung through my dreams for 35 years. I glanced out the window, watching Karen walk back to her house, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I just delivered the final offer," she said, her voice so sickeningly sweet it made me want to scream. "He'll have to join. That house is the last obstacle on Elmwood Road. Once we force it into compliance, this area's value will double." That evening, I grabbed the envelope and marched over to Karen's house. The doorbell chimed the ostentatious tune of March of Triumph, fitting for her inflated ego. Karen opened the door, wearing a neighborhood oversight president badge, grinning as if I were some honored guest. "I've read your offer carefully," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady despite my fury, thanks to 18 years of legal experience. "I decline. This house is a 5-generation family legacy, and I won't let anyone touch its historical value." Her smile vanished in an instant, like a light snuffed out by a power cut. "You don't understand the situation," she said, leaning forward, her tone hardening. "This isn't about what you want. The HOA is legally recognized. Your house is surrounded by members now. Joining is your only option." I pulled out the property map I'd spent all day digging up. "You're wrong. My deed predates any HOA agreement, and the law doesn't force me to bow to you. Years in the field had taught me to always be prepared for an adversary. Karen's face turned a furious shade of crimson, as if she might explode with rage. Listen carefully, she spat, dropping the polite mask entirely. This neighborhood is moving forward. Those who don't keep up will pay the price. Non-compliant homes run into trouble easily. Piles of complaints, fines up to your neck. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Mitchell? I asked, barely holding back the urge to slam my fist on the table. She stepped back, that fake smile snapping back into place like it had never left. Oh, not at all. I'm just concerned for your property's value. An old house like that can have so many issues, faulty wiring, weak walls. It'd be a shame if something unfortunate happened just because you're clinging to the past. Through the doorway, I caught sight of her husband standing there, phone in hand, his posture dripping with intent. A chill ran through me, tight and suffocating. I nodded politely and turned to leave, but Karen Mitchell's voice pierced my back like a needle. 3 days, she shouted from a distance. You have 3 days to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement measures. Walking back home, I felt unfamiliar eyes peering from windows. Clearly Karen's allies in that cursed HOA. My chest grew heavy with the sinking feeling that this wouldn't end with a simple refusal. That night, I installed a camera system around the house on Elmwood Road, carefully documenting every detail of its current state. 18 years in the legal field had taught me to trust my instincts, and right now, they were screaming that Karen Mitchell was only just beginning her game. What I didn't realize then was that this fight wasn't just about property values or the deep purple trim of the Victorian house. In 25 years of dealing with difficult people, I'd never encountered anyone quite like her. As I drifted to sleep amid the gentle clinking of my grandmother's wind chimes, I had no idea this was only the start of a battle that would turn everything upside down. My beloved Victorian house would soon become the first victim, but Karen had made a grave mistake targeting me. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, Karen's shrill voice outside my window made me want to smash the coffee mug in my hand. Look at that hideous purple trim. It's dragging our neighborhood's value to the gutter. I peeked through the curtains, my heart skipping a beat as I saw her leading a pack of HOA members in what they called a morning inspection. They snapped photos of every inch of my grandmother's house. I tried sipping my coffee on the porch, but their whispers carried across the lawn, tempting me to charge out and yell in their faces. Do you see those ancient wind chimes? Totally against HOA standards. And that flower mess. They're 5 centimeters over the height limit. Each day brought new complaints so absurd they drove me up the wall. They started slapping bright yellow warning notices on my door, citing violations no one cared about before that wretched HOA existed. The heritage flower garden my grandmother planted with her own hands was now dubbed a neighborhood nuisance. The Victorians' deep purple trim, once a photo stop for tourists, became their prime target. One Wednesday morning, I caught Karen measuring my grass with a ruler. 15 centimeters, she crowed triumphantly to her new assistant, Penelope Grayson, who scribbled furiously. That's 6 centimeters over standard. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, forcing myself to stay calm though I wanted to hurl the mug at her. You're trespassing on private property, I said, emphasizing each word, aware of my legal rights but not yet revealing my profession. Karen smirked dismissively and kept snapping photos. The harassment grew more cunning. They hired gardeners to show up at 6 in the morning on Sunday, machines roaring right outside my bedroom window. Anonymous complaints flooded the city management office weekly. Each time, I calmly presented documents proving the house's historic status, watching Karen grind her teeth from afar. They shifted to psychological tactics. Karen held HOA meetings right at her driveway, practically in my home office's earshot. I overheard them griping that certain people were tarnishing the neighborhood's reputation, that some houses needed handling for the greater good. I wanted to slam my desk and stand up, but I held back. My cameras caught them testing my patience. They let dogs run loose to turn my yard into a toilet, then feigned shock when I showed the footage. Oh, my darling would never, Karen exclaimed, clutching her chest dramatically, while her massive dog left another gift on my lawn. The breaking point came at the annual neighborhood party. I wasn't invited, of course. From a distance, I heard Karen loudly proclaiming plans to revitalize the area. A few outdated properties, she said, glancing toward my house, no longer fit our community's vision. Then I noticed a few people snapping photos of my house's foundation, whispering about structural issues. I stayed calm, documenting everything. Every letter, each photo, every baseless complaint. I organized them meticulously, like a lawyer preparing for a major trial. When they installed blinding security lights aimed straight at my bedroom window, I added light pollution to my growing file. My grandmother once taught me that patience is power, and as Karen's crew grew bolder, I knew my counterattack had to be perfectly timed. That night, reviewing the camera footage, I spotted something unexpected. 2 HOA board members, Lionel Baxter and Evelyn Torres, creeping around my property's boundary markers, muttering about easement rules. I realized their plan, they were brewing something bigger. They had no idea I'd spent my entire career tackling people who think they're above the law. As I turned off the porch light that evening, watching Karen's group gather in her yard, I wondered how long I should wait before showing them they'd picked the wrong opponent. But I never could have guessed that later that night, as I stepped into the kitchen for a glass of water, the lights would reveal Karen, Lionel, and Evelyn sneaking around my property. My heart tightened when I saw them holding chemical spray cans, aimed right at my grandmother's 90-year-old flower garden. "What are you doing?" I shouted from the porch, my phone already recording. Karen flinched but quickly regained her composure, flashing a sickeningly fake smile. "We're just clearing out some invasive weeds," she said, her voice dripping with honey as she kept spraying the flowers. "The HOA has strict rules about substandard plants. If you join us, we could sort this out much more smoothly." I stepped closer, anger blazing inside me, though my voice stayed steady. "Those aren't invasive, Karen. They're Victorian heritage flowers, planted by my grandmother in 1955. I have all the paperwork and certifications from the Gardening Society." Lionel and Evelyn backed off, visibly rattled, but Karen didn't flinch. "Some folks complain they smell," she shrugged, adjusting her designer pajamas. "And those thorns are a hazard to kids passing by. On my private property, behind my fence." I shot back, flipping on the security lights to flood the scene. "The boundary's clear, and you're trespassing." Just then, Roland Mitchell, Karen's husband, emerged from the shadows. A retired police sergeant. He thought he could intimidate anyone into submission. "Hey, let's not jump to conclusions," he said. "We're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. No one wants to live next to a mess." I noticed Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the elderly neighbor across the street, peeking through her curtains. She'd been pressured into joining the HOA 2 months ago after similar late-night visits. Her beautiful rock garden had been replaced with bland shrubs at Karen's whim in just a few days. The next morning, my flower garden was dead. The once vibrant petals lay wilted and blackened. I stood there, my chest aching, but then I realized Karen had unknowingly handed me a major mistake. She'd revealed how the HOA targeted specific homeowners. At lunch, I raced to the county records office and uncovered that every house that rejected the HOA had faced mysterious incidents or violations until they were forced to sell. That afternoon, I installed high-resolution cameras around the Elmwood Road house, hiding them carefully among the surviving plants. That evening, Karen led a group of potential buyers past my home. "This place will be dealt with soon," she announced loudly, her confident tone making me itch to confront her. "We have ways of handling stubborn residents." The next week was a relentless barrage of harassment. My mailbox was knocked over 4 times. Anonymous noise complaints piled up even though I'd been away for 2 straight days. City inspectors showed up daily, finding nothing but returning anyway. My trash bins vanished only to be found violating HOA rules I'd never heard of. I documented it all, methodically building my case, even as Karen's group grew more aggressive. They started holding HOA meetings right in front of my house, pointing out every tiny flaw for prospective residents to see. "This house is dragging down our neighborhood's value," Karen declared, waving her designer handbag like a scepter of authority. But don't worry, this problem will disappear soon enough. The final straw came when I caught them tampering with my historic fence posts, deliberately loosening them while pretending to measure the sidewalk. The cameras captured Karen directing her lackeys. When these posts fail inspection, he'll have to replace the whole thing with our approved design. It'll cost him a fortune unless he joins the HOA. That night, reviewing the footage, I noticed something suspicious. The HOA inspection team always included someone photographing my electrical box, gas lines, and other utilities. They were systematically cataloging every vulnerability in the house. Why? The pieces started falling into place, sending a chill down my spine. I knew I had to act fast, but I couldn't reveal my hand just yet. What I didn't know then was that Karen had already set in motion a plot that would change everything, turning my worst fears into reality. My hands trembled as I held the morning paper, reading the headline about how I just sentenced a corrupt executive to prison. The courtroom was dead silent when my clerk, Juniper Hayes, burst through the door, her face pale as a ghost. "Judge, your house? It's on fire." Those 5 words stopped my heart. I tore off my black robe, racing down the courthouse stairs, my chest tight with pain. It took only 12 minutes to drive home, but each second stretched like an eternity. Black smoke billowed 5 blocks away, twisting my stomach into knots. The deep purple trim my grandmother had so carefully painted was now swallowed by fierce orange flames. I slammed on the brakes in front of the burning house, where firefighters were already battling the blaze. The heat hit my face like an invisible wall, and the anguished groans of century-old wood under the fire's destruction echoed in my ears. Everything my family had built over 6 generations was vanishing before my eyes. Through tear-blurred vision, I saw Karen standing on her driveway, dressed in expensive yoga gear, sipping gourmet coffee like she was watching a morning show. Her perfectly styled blonde hair glinted in the sunlight as she chatted with other HOA members. They didn't even try to hide their glee, whispering and pointing at pieces of my burning home. Fire Captain Gideon Navarro approached, his face grim. "Sir, it looks like an electrical fire. Old houses like this often have unsafe wiring." But I knew better. Just yesterday, I'd had the electrical system routinely checked. Everything was up to code. I'd made sure of it after Karen's threats about dangerous historic homes at the last neighborhood meeting. The security cameras. The thought flashed in my mind. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I tried to access the footage. The screen was blank. The cameras had stopped recording at 1 in the morning, exactly 5 hours before the fire started. This was no coincidence. As I stood watching the Victorian house burn to ashes, memories flooded back, stabbing at my heart. Baking lessons in the warm kitchen with my grandmother, my law school graduation party in the flower garden, the first moment I stepped into my legal career, all turning to smoke because I wouldn't bow to Karen Mitchell's cursed HOA demands. Among the growing crowd of neighbors, I spotted 2 familiar faces. Roland Mitchell and Felix Donovan, both HOA board members, trying to blend in. But their distinctive work boots caught my eye. Identical to the ones I'd seen on camera footage last week when the flower garden was ruined. Now they were streaked with something. Mud, maybe, or ash from my own house. Karen sauntered over, her face a mask of fake concern that made me want to scream. "Oh, what a tragedy," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "If you joined the HOA, we have such strict safety standards. But you insisted on keeping that outdated charm." She lingered on the last word, then took a slow sip of coffee, savoring her apparent victory. I bit my lip until it stung, holding everything back. Not yet. I couldn't show my cards. Instead, I watched as she pulled out her phone, typing something quickly. Soon after, I overheard a nearby neighbor mention a prime lot just listed in an upscale real estate group. The firefighters finally contained the blaze, but it was too late. The intricate Victorian windows lay shattered. The hand-carved porch railing was a charred ruin, and the roof had caved in halfway. 150 years of family history, gone in mere hours. Standing amid the smoky haze, I made a choice. Karen thought she'd won, that she'd broken my spirit, but she'd just backed herself into an irredeemable mistake. I pulled out my phone and made 4 calls. One to a friend at the FBI, one to a contact at the state prosecutor's office, one to a trusted private investigator, and one to an old colleague at the courthouse. I saw Karen glance at me as I dialed, a flicker of unease crossing her face. She didn't know who I was calling, but my resolve must have unnerved her. Good. Let her worry. Because even though the house was now a pile of ashes, my true strength wasn't in property. It was in justice. As the sun climbed higher, I picked up a scorched piece of purple trim. My grandmother once said that sometimes losing everything is how you find the strength to fight back. Giving Karen's smug face one last look, I knew what I had to do next. But first, I needed to dig deeper into just how rotten this HOA really was. Standing amid the wreckage of my grandmother's home, I vowed to turn my pain into purpose. While Karen strutted around the neighborhood, spreading rumors that I'd burned my own house for insurance money, I quietly followed the clues that would dismantle her empire. The first breakthrough came from an old law school friend, now a real estate investigation expert, Gideon Hawthorne. He uncovered something odd. Every mysterious house fire in the county over the past 7 years had been sold to the same shell company, owned by Karen's sister-in-law. My hands shook as I flipped through the files, each line revealing a pattern too clear to be chance. I hired private investigator Cashin Moreau to interview former neighbors who'd lost their homes. Their stories mirrored mine. Join the HOA or face harassment, followed by unexplained accidents or fires. Most gave up, selling their properties to Karen's investment group for next to nothing. An elderly man broke down in tears, recounting how he lost family photos in a suspicious garage fire, just one day after rejecting the HOA. The big break came from an unexpected source, Karen's former financial assistant, Marisol Vega. Through my lawyer, she arranged to meet me at a small diner 3 towns away. Her hands shook as she handed me a USB drive containing 8 years of HOA financial records, explaining how Karen forced her to cook the books, threatening to report her undocumented immigration status if she didn't comply. The files revealed millions of dollars in unexplained deposits after each accidental fire. I stayed up countless nights connecting the dots. Roland Mitchell wasn't just a retired cop. He'd been a fire investigator. Every suspicious blaze in the area had been swiftly ruled an accident by him, with no further questions asked. Insurance companies had paid out tens of millions of dollars based on his reports. When I reviewed my security system, it didn't just capture the vandals. It also recorded monthly meetings at Karen Mitchell's house with real estate developers, vultures eager to build luxury condos on the land where our historic homes once stood. One of them bragged about bribing city officials to rezone the area, as long as they secured enough properties. I uncovered Karen's playbook: target prime location homes, especially historic ones hard to replicate. She'd use HOA rules to harass owners, escalating to sabotage and threats. If that failed, mysterious incidents followed. Then her group swooped in to help the desperate by buying their homes for pennies on the dollar. Late at night, digging through old county records, I found undeniable proof. Karen had done this before. For other historic neighborhoods in nearby counties met the same fate. She'd move in, form an HOA, force out those who wouldn't bend, then sell the land to developers for tens of millions. She even won a community service award for neighborhood improvement. The evidence was compelling, but I wanted it airtight. I convinced the FBI to wire Marisol Vega for a meeting with Karen. The recording captured everything. Karen boasting about her next targets, laughing about homes set to have wiring issues, and threatening to make Marisol disappear if she talked. Each day, I watched Karen strut around the neighborhood, plotting her next move, while I quietly built my case. She had no idea that every smug wave, every fake condolence about my tragic accident, was being documented. That arrogance would be her downfall. The final piece fell into place when I discovered why she targeted my house. In the city archives, I found an old map of a highway expansion project. Karen's developer friends had inside info. My property was the key to their plan for a new commercial hub. They'd bought up the surrounding land through shell companies, but the Elmwood Roadhouse was the linchpin. Without it, their billion-dollar project would collapse. As I compiled the evidence for the FBI, I noticed Karen growing reckless. She filed daily complaints about my eyesore property, now just a blackened ruin. She even brazenly proposed a special HOA fee to clean up my lot, with the money funneling straight to her. She didn't realize every move thickened the case against her. I stood outside the community center, heart pounding, watching Karen stride in with her signature coffee and a stack of papers. Tonight's HOA meeting would be different. After 8 months of meticulous preparation, I'd show her she'd messed with the wrong person. Through the window, I saw her setting up a projector, no doubt loaded with fabricated violations and nonsense rules. My hand trembled slightly as it brushed the folded judge's robe in my briefcase. The FBI wire under my jacket reminded me everything had to be perfect. Property number 319 on Elmwood Road has been declared a public nuisance. Karen's voice echoed as I quietly pushed the door open. Under our emergency authority, we'll proceed with redevelopment plans immediately. Confused murmurs rippled through the room. Decent neighbors, too afraid to defy her, shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. Any objections? Karen smirked, scanning the room. No? Well then, let me present our brilliant plan. I object, Mrs. Mitchell, I said, cutting through the tense silence. Heads turned toward the door. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my shoes tapping rhythmically on the wooden floor. Karen's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Oh, finally giving in? That charred heap of yours is such an eyesore. We're doing you a favor, trust me. She took a long sip of coffee, her smug grin as wide as it was when she watched my house burn. I opened my briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of documents. Actually, I'm here to present some evidence of my own. I spread the photos across the table. Security cameras still caught you and your board on my property the night of the fire. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? Karen's face twitched. That could be anyone in those pictures. Besides, you can't prove a thing. Oh, I can prove it, I replied, reaching into my briefcase again. Bank records showing mysterious funds flowing into her shell company after each desperate sale, emails plotting to coerce non-HOA joiners, and my favorite, her text messages instructing how to stage an electrical fire as an accident. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Karen Mitchell's hands shook, coffee sloshing out of her cup. This is utter nonsense, she screamed, her voice breaking with panic. You can't barge in here slandering me like this. I'll sue you for defamation. That was my cue. I reached into my briefcase one last time, pulling out the judge's robe. The silk unfurled dramatically as I draped it over my shoulders. Federal Judge Tobias Rutherford, I declared, relishing the satisfaction as Karen's face went white as a sheet, presiding over case number 2026 CR 317, United States versus Mitchell and co-conspirators, a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Her coffee cup slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor in a shattered mess. Hot liquid splashed onto her expensive shoes, but she didn't even notice. Her mouth opened and closed, words failing her. FBI, I called out loudly. Roland Mitchell, Karen's husband, the retired police sergeant who'd covered up every report, bolted toward the emergency exit. He didn't make it 4 steps before he was tackled to the floor. I stepped closer to Karen, who'd collapsed into her precious president's chair. Do you know the biggest mistake criminals make? I said, my voice low but firm. They get so caught up in their own power that they forget to check who they're up against. I picked up the wooden gavel she'd dropped, the one she'd used to condemn my house. This meeting is adjourned. The clink of handcuffs echoed through the room as the FBI led Karen and her cronies away. My neighbors burst into applause, years of fear and oppression finally lifted. As I gathered my documents, Mrs. Eleanor Finch from across the street rushed over and hugged me, tears streaming down her cheeks. We should have stood with you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I hugged her back, my eyes following Karen as she was escorted to the police car. Sometimes I replied softly, justice has to take the long road to get where it's needed. The morning of the trial felt different. I stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting my judge's robe, replaying Karen's laughter as my house burned. She wasn't laughing now. The courtroom was packed, neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods who'd come forward after our story hit local news. Karen walked in, dressed in an expensive suit instead of her usual yoga gear, but her face went pale when she saw me on the bench. I'll never forget her grabbing her lawyer's arm, whispering in panic, "It's him. The guy whose house we burned." Her lawyer dropped his pen. The evidence we presented stunned everyone. The investigation uncovered 18 other homes that mysteriously caught fire after rejecting Karen's HOA. The pattern was always the same: harassment, sabotage, then flames. They'd scoop up the charred properties for next to nothing through her brother-in-law's shell company, raking in billions. We played my camera footage. The courtroom held its breath as Karen and her crew were caught spreading gasoline around my grandmother's flower garden at 1 in the morning. Karen shook her head frantically, mouthing no as her own voice blared from the speakers. Once it burns, he'll have to sell. The biggest shock came when Roland Mitchell turned on her. He'd stayed silent out of loyalty, but the evidence broke him. He spilled everything: how they planned it, picked targets, and bribed local officials to look the other way. Karen screamed lies so loudly the bailiff had to drag her out. One by one, people stood to share their stories. Mrs. Lucia Mendez, a retired teacher who lost family photos, the Kapoor family whose grandfather's ashes were destroyed. Each account made Karen shrink in her seat. Her fancy suit couldn't hide her growing dread. When I delivered the verdict, my voice was steady: 30 years for Karen, 18 for each board member. Their faces showed they finally understood money couldn't save them from justice. Karen tried claiming she only wanted to improve property values, but I cut her off just as she'd ignored me when I spoke of my grandmother's flowers. That was 7 months ago. Today, I stand watching a construction crew finish the new Victorian house. The deep purple trim is back, just as my grandmother painted it. The flower garden is blooming again, grown from cuttings of the one bush that survived. Karen's house was sold to compensate victims. A kind immigrant family lives there now, their kids playing in the yard where Karen once snapped violation photos. The neighbors formed a real community group, not an HOA, but a place where people help each other. We held a block party in my garden. Everyone brought food and stories. Yesterday, Mrs. Lucia brought her famous tamales and showed off family photos her daughter had restored from the wreckage. Sometimes, while gardening, people stop to thank me not as a judge, but for not bowing to a bully. Local news did a follow-up story on how we turned a neighborhood Karen once controlled into a true community. They interviewed the Kapoors, who now host monthly meetings in their stunning backyard. I keep Karen's coffee mug, the one she dropped when she realized who I was, on my courthouse desk. It reminds me that justice can be slow but certain, just as my grandmother said. Each morning, I sip coffee in the flower garden, watching the sunrise through perfectly purple-trimmed windows, knowing sometimes the best response is to rebuild something even more beautiful than what was lost. What do you think of this story? The tale of Tobias Rutherford and his fight against Karen Mitchell and her oppressive HOA isn't just a dramatic saga, it reflects today's society where greed and power sometimes overshadow human values and history. I feel Tobias's resilience, turning the pain of loss into strength for justice, and I empathize with the helplessness of victims crushed by selfish forces. This story teaches us that with patience, careful preparation, and faith in what's right, we can overcome challenges and protect what matters. In modern life, when facing injustice, don't give in, gather evidence, use the law, and unite your community to make a difference. This story is for entertainment and education only, not meant to discriminate, criticize, or offend any person or group. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread these positive values. Thanks for watching this video all the way through. Wishing you a peaceful day and see you in the next one.